What's up, everybody? Welcome in to another edition of SSPN Live. Ethan, this is the first edition of SSPN Live from your new
Mm,
background, if you want
right.
to say. Um, so as we continue to inch closer towards the draft lottery, which I now believe is 14 days away. If I have the date right, I'm going to double check that here in a second. But that could be the start of the next chapter of the Spurs, if you will, under Victor Wembanyama.
hmm
And you shifting over to a new domain is kind of coinciding with that.
I like the way you're thinking, Jude. And in many ways, as I mature in life, the Spurs mature as a team.
We were talking about that last time. You were
Yeah.
saying how like by the time they're going to be championship ready, we're going to like have our own like homes and wives and kids and
Right.
stuff.
Right.
Okay, so I was wrong, and I'm glad that I double checked the lottery date because for some reason I thought it was the 15th, but I thought I saw something today that said it was 11 days away, and
hmm
that is correct because it is May 12th. So
Hmm.
we are less than 2 weeks away from the NBA draft lottery, Ethan. We haven't kind of checked in on that. I know we kind of already know all the details on that for the most part, but just to open up the episode as we're inching closer towards that draft lottery. Even though this may be some stuff that you've already said before, what are your feelings on it here as of May 1st, now that we are officially in the month that it's going to happen?
I'm pretty relaxed about it. Last year, I was a little more anxious about it, thinking about it night and day, because obviously we had the opportunity to get Victor Wembanyama at number one, and I think both of us were like had convinced ourselves that it was like it's just not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. Like we've had
Hmm.
enough luck as it is. We've gotten two Hall of Famers at one. We're not going to get a third, and we happen to get them. So this year, what are we like the fifth best odds right now
Hmm.
for the number one pick? I don't envision that happening. I'm pretty comfortable with the fact that we'll probably be 6'5", 4", whatever it is in that range, and that's still a really nice pick. And there's no player that my mouth is watering over that I just absolutely have. This draft it's a solid draft, but it's not like star potential loaded in my eyes, or superstar potential loaded at least, kind of like how last year's was. But I'm comfortable with where we are going in, and if there is a possibility that Toronto can drop to 7 and we can get two top 10 picks, I'll be ecstatic.
Yeah, I completely agree with your sentiment there, and I just figured because we're talking about it, Ethan, let's go ahead and start this stream
Do it.
off with a tankathon.
Whoa.
Not that bad. Not that bad. I know we don't get the Toronto pick here, but I'm never going to be mad at getting a top 3 pick in any situation, Ethan.
Right, right. This would also be a nice scenario. Like, there's really no scenario where I'm going to be upset. I guess, like, what's the worst case scenario? Spurs drop to what, 6, and then we don't get Toronto. Toronto moves up to like top 3.
I think there might be a situation. Let me go ahead and let me just pull up the odds before I say that. But I think there is a scenario where Toronto can jump up and we can also fall down to like 7 or 8.
Yeah, that would be the worst. But even
So
still,
there you
there's
go.
say, I mean, it's possible. It's not likely, but it's possible. 7, I guess, is most likely if we're going to drop. Um, but even if that were to happen, like, there's still guys, and the two guys that we're talking about today, kind of in detail, that we'll get into a little bit later, are guys that could be available at that spot even still. So, like, there's still names that we can get as low as 7 or 8 or 9.
Absolutely, Ethan. And with it kind of being a little bit more of a, I guess at least in comparison to last year's draft, for example, like being a little bit less of a sure thing on like superstar upside, that kind of does make those lower top 10 picks a little bit more valuable.
Right.
There's not as big of a gap from the top 5 to maybe those players in today's draft. And we got my man Drew King, who's been giving me a lot of intel today. He's given me intel in the past. And he starts with a good little question here, Ethan, before we get into all the stuff we got on the docket. Under or over 2.5 All-Stars in this draft?
I'm going to say over, because I think that there's at least two guys in the top 5 that are like pretty much like pretty close to being for sure all stars, and then there's always going to be that sleeper guy,
Right.
whether that be mid first or even second round, that just surprises everybody that nobody saw coming. So I'm going to go with over.
I don't want to just completely copycat you here, Ethan, but I really think that, especially with, the two guys that we're about to get into
Mhm.
today, I really think there's going to be at least three. As much as I do agree this draft is not as appealing as last year's and probably won't be as appealing as 2025's, when you look at Cooper Flagg and some of those guys that are going
Right.
to come out of next year's draft as well. But I do think, just because there's always going to be that sleeper, I think there's going to be at least two All-Stars in the top 10, and then there's going to be somebody that pops out. But you never know. There could be three in the top 10 that turn out to be All-Star level players too.
Right. I think what's crazy about this draft in particular is that there is so much unknown. I feel like in most years, like it's pretty certain, like you're looking at guys and like, oh yeah, he's going to be a terrific player, a franchise player. And I don't know if you could say that about everybody in this draft, but like you said, there's nobody that's like significant. There's not like a significant drop off
Mm-hmm.
either, at least in the lottery pick situation.
Yes, I completely agree, Ethan. But we do have some other stuff to get into before we dive into our two prospects that we'll be going over today that you guys can already see on the title and a little bit in the thumbnail. That is going to be UConn guard Stephon Castle and then Kentucky guard Rob Dillingham. But there's been a lot of talk in the past couple days, Ethan.
Mhm.
And before we get into this, let me just put a caveat, asterisk, whatever you want to call it. Like, we put Devin Booker in the thumbnail today. That is not me or Ethan saying that the Spurs are even going to pursue going to get Devin Booker. But
Mhm.
Mike Finger, who is a longtime columnist for the San Antonio News Express, wrote a story about how maybe that isn't the most far-fetched thing that you think. But it's not even really about Devin Booker. And we'll get into this story in just a second here, Ethan. But it's more about just the idea of the Spurs making a move for someone like a Devin Booker. The fact
Mhm.
that that's being floated around, talked about, that's not something that's really happened. You could maybe find some little inklings in like the DeRozan era. You know what I mean? Where maybe we were like, can we make a move to try to get
Mhm.
another star here or something like that? But really, even then, like that was never really likely in the DeRozan, DeJounte, Rudy Gay,
Right.
end
Right.
of
Right.
LaMarcus Aldridge era. Like you and I, even if we talked about that, we didn't really think there was that much legitimacy to it. I would say since we've started doing this podcast, this is probably the most legitimate smoke, if you will,
Mhm.
whenever it comes to just people talking about the Spurs potentially moving for a player. I just mentioned Mike Finger. It's not just that. Brian Windhorst went on the Pat McAfee show earlier this week, and he says he doesn't know necessarily who it's going to be. They were actually talking about LeBron and his potential
Mhm.
contract. And I don't want to go too deep into that. That's a whole nother thing because Wendy came out with some other news about that today too. But aside from that, basically Brian Windhorst just came out and said, I think at some point, like there's going to be someone out there. He said it was he suggested maybe more of a middle-aged player, not like necessarily an old player, but a player who's more, closer to their prime and knows they're a number two guy and realizes their situation just
Mhm.
isn't as attractive as like playing with somebody like Victor, for example. That's what he kind of alluded to. But then the next day, Shams Charania, another very well-known basketball insider, the only person who is, you guys all know this listening, but still, for podcast purposes, the only person who has ever rivaled Woj whenever it comes to breaking news.
Mhm.
Um, he went on and essentially suggested the same thing, and he specifically talked about point guards. But what he also said in his answer is that basically, until we make a move because of Victor being Victor and because of the point guard spot being a big need for the Spurs, we're going to be floated in basically every conversation, for potential point guards that could be on the move. And that's why you've heard stuff about Darius Garland potentially if Donovan Mitchell and him don't work out. Now, obviously, they just took a 3-2 lead against the
Mhm.
Magic. So if they can continue to win and maybe even win a second series, that's probably going to be a little bit more out of the question. Obviously, there was the whole Trae Young thing. That's actually seemed to siphon off a little bit more. I think the and this kind of ties into the Mike Finger point that we'll get into here in a little bit. But the Trae Young talk is almost more representative of the Spurs just going into that lane. Like I mentioned with Devin Booker, it's not necessarily that Trae Young or Devin Booker are realistic trade targets for the Spurs, but the fact that these players are even being talked about is a significant change in the world of Spurs fans, Ethan. I think is probably the best way that I can sum all of that up in a bow. What are your kind of overall thoughts on this? And then we'll kind of get into some of the articles.
It's weird because it's the first time, like you said, it's about to become commonplace for the Spurs to be mentioned in pretty much every trade discussion moving forward because of Victor Wembanyama. And I think there's multiple angles of this. Obviously, the NBA media is going to bring it up because Victor Wembanyama gets clicks. He's what's hot right now. So anytime someone's available, it's how would he fit next to Victor Wembanyama? Also going into that, everyone likes to start the clock on young players. Victor Wembanyama was so great his first year. It's time to kind of make moves and get competitive, right? That all makes sense. Are any of these viable or
Right.
valid? I don't know. And I think we won't know until the Spurs make a move. Like the first move that they make will tell us a lot about the direction that they're going to go or the lack of move. If they don't make a move, then we know all of this is just the classic media smoke and none of it actually has any fire. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Um, I do like what you said because it echoes what we had brought up a long time ago about the middle aged or closer to the end of his prime second star that could sign with the Spurs in free agency. I know LeBron's name was mentioned. I don't think that will happen. I mean, it's a good story, but I just don't think he's going to leave Los Angeles.
Right.
But names that I want to keep in mind that maybe we had treated with a little more skepticism prior that I'm starting to kind of open up to are Paul George, Klay Thompson, because both of those guys fit that bill of kind of toward the Paul George is more in his prime than Klay Thompson is obviously, but toward the end of their prime, um, second level players. Paul George has openly said he's the second option to Kawhi. Klay Thompson obviously is one of the greatest second options to Steph Curry. They kind of fit next to Wembanyama. Paul George has stopped negotiations with his contract extension with the Clippers, and obviously Klay Thompson's situation has been widely publicized. So those are names that I would keep a lookout on. The Trae Young thing, I was a big proponent of that move earlier, kind of toward February, March of this past season. Kind of falling off on that only because of what the Spurs said or what the report was about the Spurs. That if a trade with Atlanta was going to happen, they would rather it be for DeJounte Murray than for Trae Young, which I was a little surprised by, but I understand their angle on that. I think we all have to talk about Trae Young's deficiencies and what DeJounte would bring. Like that's all been talked about. There's no need to rehash that. But it is interesting that we're going to have to start talking about this more often because kind of where SSPN laid its foundation was like not getting into the rumor mill and trying to stay, to the facts. But this is
Right.
going to dominate Spurs discussion rooms and what everyone's discussing amongst fans for a long time until the moves are actually made.
You tied that up perfectly there at the end, and that's the thing, like why I'm trying to be clear here. Like I'm saying, yes, we put Devin Booker in the thumbnail, but it's more representative of like when was the last time a San Antonio Express news columnist wrote about the Spurs potentially trading for, a superstar level player of that caliber? And it's
Right.
been a while, you know. And we'll get into that article right now, Ethan. So I haven't read this. I've just saw the tweet and then I wanted to save it for the episode. So we're going to go through this article here from Mike Finger, who has been, since I was like, what's the word? Conscious enough to like start following the Spurs on my own. You know what I
Right.
mean? And like looking up articles as like maybe like a preteen or something. Like Mike Finger has been working at the San Antonio Express News. So
Mm-hmm.
he is an OG when it comes to covering the Spurs.
Right.
But as you can see, here's the title: Why Suns Misery Could Make Devin Booker a Perfect Fit for the Spurs. The reasons it won't happen are obvious. So see how he starts it off,
Mm-hmm.
right? First, the mortgage billionaire who owns the Phoenix Suns probably isn't ready to concede he made the same mistake with his basketball team as so many of his in over their heads customers made with their finances. Denial can be a powerful thing. I'm honestly not sure exactly what he's referring to there, unless it's just bringing in Bradley Beal. Um, Second, Victor Wembanyama has given the Spurs the luxury of supreme patience. They don't need to mortgage anything today. They don't need to mortgage anything tomorrow. And they're certainly not going to lock themselves this summer into any deal they reasonably believe they can top in 2 or 3 years. That's a really good point. So why then should we spend even 1 second pondering the crazy idea of San Antonio trading for Devin Booker? Because it's not as crazy as it sounds, and the fit might be better than you think. Before it can happen, though, some conditions must be met. The Suns, trailing 4-0 in their first-round playoff series with Minnesota, need one more loss to complete their season-long transformation from vaunted super team to dysfunctional bust. That's a truthful but harsh way to put it. I feel bad for the guys there, but it is true. He's not wrong. And we saw what happened. They ended up getting swept. Then someone in Phoenix will have to recognize that their situation is hopeless. Is that going to happen? Probably not. They're probably going to stick to it, especially with all the investment they just made. But still, with Victor, this stuff becomes much more of a reality than it was before. With more than $150 million per year committed to Booker, Kevin Durant, and Bradley Beal alone, the Suns have no viable way to make the team around them better. Very fair. They cannot sign free agents to anything beyond minimum salaries, and under the new collective bargaining agreement, their payroll prevents them from trading the few future draft picks they still own. So I guess because they're so much over the cap, they have restrictions on draft picks they can make.
Yep.
This is the dilemma second-year owner Matt Ishiba, the CEO and chairman of the United States Wholesale Mortgage, created when he sold off every movable Suns asset to add Durant and Beal. Now, there are 2 ways this can go. Ishiba can choose the stubborn approach and run it back with the same group that flopped this season, hoping that a coaching change and more time together can fix it. Honestly, I feel like that's probably the more likely scenario. Or he can blow it up. All that would take is Durant to get fed up, just like he did in the last place that built an ill-advised gold-plated superstar balloon around him, i.e. Brooklyn. This is where things start getting interesting. Beal's contract, which is due to pay him $57 million at the age of 33 in 3 years, is as untradeable of an NBA deal as it gets. That means the only big moves the Suns can make to trade Durant, to trade Booker, or to trade them both and commit to a rebuild. The availability of Booker is sure to at least catch the Spurs' attention because there aren't many conceivable acquirable all-stars who can offer them what Booker does. His skill set at both ends of the floor and his personality provide a dream fit with what would make with what the Spurs want a Wembanyama team to be, and he would not require them to make any major changes to their intended timeline. Booker will play next season at age 28. He signed for 4 years through age 31. His peak doesn't perfectly sync with Wembanyama's, but it doesn't need to. In a perfect world, the Spurs can draft their all-NBA point guard of the future this June, and Devin Vassell takes another big leap as Wembanyama's pick-and-roll partner, and the 3 of them win together for a decade while general manager Brian Wright uses his bounty of draft picks to fill in around the edges, i.e. OKC. But the Spurs got really, really lucky the first time they pulled off something like that. And when Tim Duncan, Manu Ginobili, and Tony Parker did it, they started out as championship contenders. If Wembanyama's Spurs never trade for a star, it will take them years to get where Duncan began. That I am a little bit, what's the word? I don't necessarily disagree, but I think that with how good Victor is, like with the type of player he is, I think that could accelerate that a little bit faster. But that's besides the point. Let's just finish this out. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that approach, and again, there's no urgency to open the title window now. You wouldn't do it for a soon-to-be 36-year-old Durant. He says you wouldn't do it for Trae Young. I don't know if Spurs wouldn't do that, but that kind of ties into, once again, like we just talked about earlier, and I forgot to mention this too, Shams even brought that up again, that like it was confirmed, like Shams is saying through his sources, which are probably the most reliable out there other than Woj, that the Spurs did call the Hawks and specifically asked about DeJounte Murray and not Trae Young. So I get what he's saying there, but also it's like still that the Trae Young thing ties into what we talked about earlier with Devin Booker and just a potential. I mean, I know Devin Booker's not necessarily a point guard, but he's kind of had to play that for them this year. But an all-star, guard like that, in that vein, if you will.
Right.
But for Booker, who has thrived as both a lead dog and a sidekick, wouldn't you at least have to think about it? If you have as many as 12 first-round picks in the next 7 years as the Spurs do, would you part with 3 or 4 of them for an elite shooter and playmaker who can defend and also fill in at point guard if needed? Would you do it for a guy who on more than one occasion has raved about his respect for both Wembanyama and Greg Popovich? I forget about the Team USA connections. For a guy who embraced his Mexican-American roots while becoming a fan favorite in Phoenix. We know how that would go in San Antonio. And then for a guy who, at the very least, would take pressure off of Wembanyama to carry the Spurs up every step of their climb from the cellar to the play-in to the playoffs to the finals. Maybe the Spurs won't. Maybe they'll opt for an upgrade that won't require as much of an investment, like a Chris Paul or a Darius Garland or even a DeJounte Murray. Maybe they'll wait for someone closer to Wembanyama's age, Cade Cunningham, to ask out of a bad spot. But someday they're going to be in the position to take advantage of another team's poor planning. And if a down-and-out mortgage billionaire gives them a call this summer, here's betting they at least pick up the phone. So, Ethan, I have talked throughout that whole thing. So I'm going to go ahead and dish it back to you here as we get back on here. And you can just give me your thoughts and reaction to Mike Finger's piece.
Look, I love Devin Booker as a player. I think he would fit wonderfully on the team next to Victor Wembanyama. And like he finished the article with, if they called, if there was an offer, I think we have to listen to it. I think a lot of the players that we currently have are on the table. Drew King's comment's funny.
I know. Appreciate you, Drew.
It was excellent reading, Jude. Where I kind of dive away from this being a possibility is two points. One, I don't think Phoenix is going to blow it up. And even if they did, I don't think Devin Booker is the guy that they're moving. I know Beal's got an untradeable contract, but that's been said before. They'd find a way to get out of that. And Kevin Durant, I think, would be the most likely to get moved. There's a lot of reasons to that. One, Devin Booker's younger. Two, he was drafted by Phoenix. So, he's the guy that they would probably want to keep around and build around. And to my knowledge, in the post-game pressers, I know they've all been a little salty about getting swept, but Devin Booker's probably been the most supportive of the team in the front office from what I've seen. I don't know if you've seen something different. I know Kevin Durant's complained about the way that he was utilized. I know Bradley Beal had a lot of things come out, about how he treated Frank Vogel and the disrespect by slapping his hand away, all that stuff. So I think of those three guys, he's the most likely that they will hold on to because, like Victor Wembanyama said in the comments, he holds the most value. With all that being said, to finish off again, if he was available, if they made the call, put me on record. Ethan would like to answer the phone and see at least what they would like for him.
Yeah, and that's basically Mike Finger's point here. I think the biggest line in this entire story, Ethan, is, or I'm going to read this last paragraph again because I think it sums up what I was trying to get at from the beginning and what I think we should take away from Windhorst going on ESPN and talking about it, Shams going on ESPN and talking about it, and this column that we haven't seen in a while. And I'm here at the bottom. Mike Finger arrived at the Express News in 1999. Right. I mean, so he has been here through the entirety. He's been here through the 5 championship years, literally the beginning of it, and then also everything else that followed. So I'll just read this one more time. Maybe the Spurs won't. Maybe they'll opt for an upgrade that won't require as much of an investment like a Chris Paul or a Darius Garland or even a DeJounte Murray. Maybe they'll wait for someone closer to Wembanyama's age, Cade Cunningham, to ask out of a bad spot. Here's the sentence, though. But someday they're going to be in position to take advantage of another team's poor planning. And we are going to be significantly more attractive than we have been maybe ever.
Right. I think that's probably a guarantee. I just don't know if it's
even this offseason.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, as much as there's all this smoke about it and Windhorst is like, I really think something's going to happen this year. It's like, with the Spurs, you never know. And with the attractiveness of next year's draft as well, we'll see how the lottery goes, and how some of those players play out. I mean, it's hard to project because as we're talking about this is more legitimate as it's ever been. So it's like, if there is a move made this summer, that could completely, change the trajectory of all the other potential stuff I'm talking about for next year. But because of just the nature of the league, there might not be that move available until the trade deadline next year. I think you've talked about that before.
Right.
And maybe it could be this summer, but like we're not going to sit here and predict that. And we don't have the insider information, if we're being honest, to be like, oh, I know when there's going to be a move available. Like we just don't know that.
Mm. You know what Henry Rosas just put in the comments is kind of an interesting thought process. I know everyone's talking about Devin Booker because of that article, but honestly, if Kevin Durant was available, I would throw some things to get Kevin Durant to replace basically Julian at that small forward spot. That would be kind of crazy. And toward the end of his career, like I know he's what 30, 36, 37.
36.
He can play till he's 40 with his play style. God forbid a horrific injury were to happen, but he can play for 4 more years.
But if you're doing that, and I guess I totally get what you're saying there. But at that point, wouldn't you maybe want to just go for Paul George in free agency because
Exactly.
he's a
That's all
little bit
fair.
younger? You know what I'm saying? And when you said that earlier, like, and I'm not saying that's for sure going to happen, but if the Spurs are going, that's a thing that's like I think could be realistic. Like, yes, he's older, but he can immediately slot in and take the because basically we've talked about it all year. The only other person other than Victor that can consistently get their own shot on the Spurs is Devin Vassell. And then when he's off the floor, that's a whole nother litany of things. I mean, that would really immediately Paul George coming in would probably be just the number 2 guy because he's a veteran, you know what I mean? And has all of that playoff experience and everything. And obviously he would take a lot of the load off Victor, but when I'm looking at that, I'm like, he would take a ton of the load off Devin as well. And I
Sure.
think he's someone who could just come in and, kind of seamlessly fit at that 3 spot. Am I saying that we're going to do that? No, not necessarily. But these are the type of things that can come to mind now, and they're more realistic than they were before.
Not to stir the pot even more, Jude, but if you go back to 2016, 17, when Paul George was asking for a trade initially from Indiana, his number 1 team was San Antonio, I'm pretty sure. Or at least
And
top
that was
3.
because of the Kawhi connection. That's the
It
only, I
was.
guess, a little bit caveat, but still.
Even still, he has that respect for Pop. He fits the identity, defensive-minded guy that became a great offensive player. And just replace Julian Champagny with Paul George in that lineup. That's pretty darn good, in my opinion.
It would definitely be a significant upgrade. And I don't think that's crazy to say.
Not at all.
But yeah, those are just some thoughts. I'm trying to think if there's anything else, any other articles. No, I have some other articles that we're going to get to, but whenever it comes to just the Spurs trade talk that we put in the title of today's video, I'm pretty sure that wraps it up there, Ethan.
Beautiful. Let's keep it going. Keep it moving.
Any final thoughts on it before we move on?
I wouldn't hold your breath if you're hoping for Devin Booker, but a move, maybe. Anything, something.
It will be interesting to watch. But, Ethan, the other thing that is going on in Spurs world is, of course, as we get closer to the draft lottery in the NBA draft, I mean, it's basically draft season. It's been draft season. We've been talking about a lot of different prospects as of late, and we have 2 more to talk about today. And that is, as we started at the beginning, or said at the beginning, Stephon Castle and Rob Dillingham. Is there any that you want to start with, Ethan?
Dealer's choice.
This is just, I'm sorry. Greg Castillo, breaking news. Shetty Osman signs max contract. He's coming home, baby.
Bring him back. Bring him back. Most consistent player on the team.
Give him the rest of our cap.
Honestly, for a year, just give him bank.
Him and Luka Samanic, rest of the cap.
Is Luka a free agent?
He is. He's unrestricted too.
Bring back the prodigal son.
He's got to start. If we were to ever bring Luka Samanic back, which I don't think will happen, but if we for some reason did, his first game has to be against the Magic, because as you know, Ethan, back in the day on SSPN, we reacted to that game, and I was like, I don't know, it's kind of weird how they just immediately subbed him out after he didn't get back on defense. I don't want to create too much stuff here. Lo and behold, we wake up the next day and he's cut.
Right. Yeah. Would be a great story. And real quick, not to put a caveat
You're
this whole
good.
thing,
You're
but
good.
Gregory Castillo said, "Bring back you goat." Obviously, for those of you who are new, he's talking about my favorite player in Spurs history, Drew Eubanks, who just got swept in the playoffs. He was a Phoenix Sun. Did you see what was said in the post game presser after they were swept by Cat and Anthony Edwards?
Did
Did you?
they did they crap on
No,
Eubanks?
no, no, no.
Oh.
Anthony Edwards is looking at the box score and he goes, "Man, Eubanks didn't play." And Cat was like, "Yeah, yeah, no, they didn't play him." And he was like, "He played good for them." And then and then Cat goes, "It ain't our job to worry about that." And I was like, "Ant knows, bro. Ant knows who's good."
Oh. You know what's crazy too is like they got swept. Like that's and then you have him saying that like, oh
That's
my
so funny
goodness.
to me, dude. It's the
Oh
one
my
guy he didn't put on a poster.
everybody loves some Drew.
I miss
And
him.
also, shout out Victor. He says, bring back Boban so he can
Mm.
give us all the free chicken.
You know what? Drew has a player option, low key. Let's bring him back and just trade Zach.
Trade Eubanks for Zach? Or trade Zach for Eubanks?
I'm with that. I'm with that. See if that's possible.
I guess he might be a little too much money
I
now
think
that I'm
so.
thinking
Yeah.
about it. But to be honest, when it comes to Zach's deficiencies off the bench, I mean,
Drew's that man. He's working on that shot.
he's literally like all the weaknesses. That's what Drew's good at.
Hmm.
Uh,
Let it simmer. Let it simmer. We'll talk about it next time.
oh my gosh, I love it. But let's get into these draft prospects. I know I asked that earlier, and I have made a decision for us, Ethan. We're going to go with Stephon Castle first because I think the Rob Dillingham conversation, you'll understand a little bit more. I haven't even really given you any hints of this, but
Mm,
I'm gonna talk a little bit longer on that. We'll get to that. But
okay.
let's go ahead and start off with Stephon Castle, Ethan. And basically just the way we'll work, Ethan will ask me some questions here and there, just on some of these guys. I've had a little bit more time to look into their highlights and stuff like that. So Ethan, I'm just gonna read off their notes and then
Mm,
you can kind of ask some high IQ basketball questions
that's what I do
that
best.
I've gotten from you many times. Okay. So this is just kind of off the top of the dome, not really starting like offense, defense, or anything. This is just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 bullet points that I wrote down about Stephon Castle after
Okay.
diving into his tape. Strength and physicality when driving to the rack, can finish through contact consistently. Inside the arc, he's fairly polished as a mid-range shooter, driver, and on-ball creator. His off-ball offensive movement is pretty solid, and he understood how to play in UConn's offense and knew when to cut, and when to provide the proper space. And while I was doing this deep dive on his tape, his highlights, whatever you want to call it, um, there were a lot of there were a lot of videos and articles that I found just about the complexity of Dan Hurley's offense at UConn.
Mm,
Um, and it makes sense. I mean, with it having the success that they had, they've won back-to-back national championships. But obviously to have a good system, I mean, think about the Spurs system. As much as it's one of the best systems in NBA history, it is very complex. Just like the UConn system, it's one of the more complex ones in college basketball. So the fact that he kind of always felt like he knew where he was supposed to be within the scheme, I think is a testament to his basketball IQ whenever it comes to, just the system that they were running. He showed flat, and these are very small flashes, but I'm bringing this up because shooting is probably his biggest question mark. He did show flashes of catch and shoot ability, as well as even some off the dribble distance shooting, but it wasn't consistent. But he did show some flashes. It's almost, I would say it's reminiscent. You could say CD a little bit, but I think he's coming in with a little bit more of a jump shot than CD. I would say it's kind of reminiscent to, and I know this is a different position, but I think you'll get where I'm going here. I would say his offense, like shooting wise, is kind of reminiscent to Paolo Banchero coming out
mm,
of Duke. And maybe Paolo was a little bit better of a shooter from deep than he was coming out, but kind of like in that range where most of his offense is inside the arc. And he's going to have to develop that 3-pointer a little bit more, to get where he wants to go once he gets to the league. Because at this point in today's NBA, like, you have to shoot. So as much as that has been a struggle for him throughout his, you could say there were some struggles in high school as well. If you look into his research, or if you just research him a little bit, I remember on the big board we read from Kevin O'Connor and The Ringer, they mentioned that as well. But at the same time, like, if you're in this era of basketball, you're going to have to shoot. And to be fair, even though the percentage wasn't great in college, it did improve from high school. Still sub 30%. So obviously the consistency still needs to get better. He just needs to improve in general there. But I don't think, like, if you're playing basketball in today's day and age, that that's something that you just have to consistently work on. I mean, look at Jeremy Sohan even. I know that's not perfect, but I have faith that, like, this offseason, and after he goes through all the combines and has all these scouting visits, he's probably already got it from scouts throughout this entire year with how highly of a ranked prospect he is, that's something he has to work on. So I'm sure he's focusing on that. That's my rant on his shooting. But to finish this off, has a feel for finding his teammates and draws attention with the ball in his hands, especially when he's driving inside the arc, off screens, or just off of the dribble. And that was something that stood out to me a ton. And that's kind of why I brought up the offense point as well, because it wasn't just like him knowing where to place himself, when he didn't have the ball in his hands, and knowing when to cut to the basket, on certain actions that they had. It almost seemed like in some of their offense, they had like options. So like, depending on how the play went, he would either cut to the basket or fade a little bit more back towards the 3-point line if he's like standing at the elbow. I saw that a couple times. But anyways, this is what I was going to get to. Lost my train of thought there for a second. Playmaking also within the offense, like the fact that he was able, like, he would make passes to players like before they got there, if that makes sense. Like, he would make the pass, and obviously the player was cutting to that area, but they weren't there. He was anticipating them being there because of his understanding of the offense. He also just made, some good passes, driving to the rack, just drawing two defenders, or just attention in general to, if he's driving inside, you've got guys crashing inside, leaving a shooter open, dishing out there. But his playmaking really stood out to me is the bottom line. That really, like, that wasn't something that I had really had in my brain about him going into this. Like, I knew he was a good, scorer inside the arc and was a good defender, but his playmaking really flashed to me. And when I was reading the stuff about UConn's offense, it stood out even more. But final two things, and this is just really simple. Defense is very polished on and off the ball. It's kind of what I just alluded to. The turnovers he creates a lot of times lead to easy transition buckets for not only himself, but also his teammates. And as I mentioned earlier, he can finish through contact off the dribble in the half court. And he also does this in transition when he creates these turnovers. And this is the last thing I'll say on him defensively. Has eyes on the ball defensively at all times. He can pickpocket a defender who's guarded by somebody else if they dribble near him. And he can also rotate off double teams effectively so that defenders aren't left open. He's basically if he's going to go give help, he realizes he has to sprint back, to make sure that there's not, somebody wide open under the basket or on the 3-point line. And so I'll finish this off, Ethan. I came up with ceilings and floors for him. And I'm not going to have this as much for Rob Dillingham because I did get interrupted a little bit before I went live, so I wasn't able to write as many detailed notes, but I still did watch a lot of him. So I'll, word salad all my thoughts here in a little bit. But going back to Stephon Castle, the ceiling I had, a mixture of Jimmy Butler and DeJounte Murray. Okay, because he's a 6'6" guard, kind of in between those two guys. But I think the other thing, this is the last thing I'll say, kind of going back to him, I think I see him as more of a 2 or a 3, but I really think he has the versatility, Ethan, to play 1 through 3. He's not necessarily a natural point guard, but it wouldn't be, if you started him at the point guard position, this is not going to be Jeremy Sohan. Like, he's got a much different handle. You know what I mean? He can drive. He's got a controlled dribble. He can drive to the basket. He can use his strength, to even create space, even if it's just when he's dribbling. You know what I mean? If guys are trying to pressure, if you put ball pressure on Stephon Castle, it's not just going to implode the offense is what
Right.
I'm trying to say. And like I said, also talking about his passing, that really stood out to me. So that's kind of why I threw in DeJounte there a little bit. And then his floor that I put is, and this is, I was kind of shooting in the dark here. Maybe it wouldn't be as good as this, but this is just what I came up with because I think at the worst, he's going to just be a solid defender. I put Tony Allen and Herb Jones.
I like both of those players. From someone who hasn't gotten a chance to watch all of the tape that you have, Jude, the only thing I know that's amazing about this kid is his defensive ability, and what's not great is his shooting ability. So I'm going to play devil's advocate here. If
Go
we
for
were
it.
to draft him, not shooting great from three last year at 26%, where would we play him? If we put him at the starting point guard spot, he's not as great of a playmaker yet as Trey Jones. If we put him at starting small forward, he's not as good of a shooter as Julian Champagnie. So do you bring him off the bench? Go ahead. I can see your wheels are turning.
No, you're good. It's just funny you brought up Trey Jones because that was another thought I had watching this, Ethan.
Mm-hmm.
Offensively, like I will say, he's probably just coming into the league. He's going to be a rookie. He's not going to be as good as Trey Jones playmaking just
Right.
because of Trey Jones' experience. But to be honest, man, like how do I'm trying to think how I want to word this. Basically, when I was watching the tape, I had the thought to myself, like, this is actually very similar to Trey Jones. And obviously we saw Trey Jones' shooting get better throughout the season.
Mm-hmm.
But except like what are Trey Jones's struggles? Finishing through contact consistently at the rim, right?
Mm-hmm.
On floaters or layups. That's something that Stephon Castle, I don't think is going to have as much. That's like his strengths. Maybe not as much floaters, but still like finishing in contact at the rim. And he still does have some little mid-range moves. And I would say they're more like pop shots than floaters, if you will, or even just like jumpers inside the paint.
Mm-hmm.
But there were a lot of things that he did that I was like, this is just what Trey Jones is kind of doing right now because you have the shooting limitations, but he's just doing it better. But that's obviously specifically the scoring. But it's just funny you brought him up because when I was watching it, I was like, and obviously he's a two guard. He's a different player than Trey. But I really did see, like, I was like, this is kind of just when you think about the non-shooting aspect, like all the scoring deficiencies that Trey has because you could say his size and also just, he's a second round pick instead of a top 10 prospect like Stephon.
Right.
All of those offensive scoring deficiencies inside the arc, like that's like what Stephon excels in. You see what I'm saying?
I do. Sorry, I just saw one of the comments.
No, I didn't see that. That's great.
Look at
I
the
see
one
the one
above
before.
it too.
Michael Ingle in here for y'all on podcast. He says, Ethan is an efficient shooter all day. And then Greg says, Ethan is definitely elite.
I mean, you should see me on the Papa Shot machine, Jude. That's all I'm saying. In an arcade, Ethan is deadly. On the court, not so much. Depends on the day. Great answer to that question. I like that you said he could possibly play the wing, at least if his playmaking doesn't
He's
translate.
more naturally a wing than he is a PG. And I see like Easy says Castle is not a PG. And I understand what he's getting at because he is more naturally a 2 or a 3.
Mm-hmm.
But when I watch his playmaking tape, and he also had 3 assists. And I know it's like, oh, it's only 3 assists. Rob Dillingham was the leading assister on Kentucky. In at least some percentage. Maybe it's not like the actual number. Go watch NBA Ceilings film sesh or NBA Ceilings. No Ceilings NBA's film sesh that they did on Rob Dillingham, and they bring up some assist stat, but I believe he also led them in assists, and he only had 4. Really, the point that I'm getting to, though, is you're not going to see as many like 8 or 9 assist guys in college just because of the style of the game. So I think, and there are a lot of playmaking abilities that at the 3, we've seen that today just in the modern NBA. But I mean, there are a lot of times that UConn just straight up put the ball in his hands And, whether he's driving to the basket, off a pick and roll or off the dribble, that can almost create a lot of open looks, whether it's on a roll or an open shooter on the perimeter. But a lot of times they would put the ball in his hands and he would orchestrate the sets, and they'd have shooters running off ball screens, and he'd be dishing it to him. There was this one white dude, number 12 on UConn. I'm sorry, I don't know your name, but he was sniping. And there were so many assists where Stephon was setting up the set, calling it, and then dishing it to him running off screens. So I think there are some flashes and some potential to maybe play him at the 1, but he is by far more naturally a 2 or a 3. But I wouldn't, there are probably some better options in this draft, Ethan, but when you ask me where to play him, that really stuck out to me. The playmaking stuck out to me, but I would still say that he is definitely more naturally a 2 or a 3.
Not to bring up recency bias, because I know this guy's getting a lot of hype as he's an MVP candidate, but I want to keep in mind Shai Gilgeous-Alexander had a very similar build and statistical numbers to this guy. I think Stephon has more of upside defensively coming into the draft than Shai did, and obviously Shai was a way better shooter. So everyone in the comments is going to say that immediately. Shai was like a 40% shooter from college, but field goal percentage-wise, they were the same. Just something to keep in mind, that this build in a point guard is something that we're seeing more and more often.
It's so funny you bring him up. You brought up Trey Jones and then you brought up SGA, and I forgot that I had a thought about both of them, Ethan, and now you're bringing them up. Because when I was watching him, I had that thought. I was like, he's not as natural of a point guard as Shai whatsoever. But when I was watching him, I was like, he's kind of like if Shai was jacked. And wasn't as good of a shooter. Wasn't as good of a shooter. That's really what I was thinking. But I want to get to another comment here because I talked about this just a second ago, and Drew just corrected me. He is also a college basketball reporter in the SEC, so let's take his word for it. But also, this is exactly what I was referring to when I was talking about the no ceilings video and the stat they're referring to. Dillingham was second to Reed Sheppard with 3.9 assists per game, but he was number 1 at Kentucky and in assist rate, and number 71 in the country in assist rate, accounting for 29.8% of the Wildcats' dimes while on the floor. So that was the stat that I was thinking about, was that he was number 1 in Kentucky at assist rate. And he doesn't have, the most, but even Reed, I would have to go look that up, but I don't think he averaged more than 5 assists. And he's obviously a very good playmaker. It's just the college style of game is more in the half court and different.
Right. I see what you're saying. And MEZ, I don't think I said SJ was not a good defender in college. If I did,
he might just be agreeing with you.
Oh, okay. I apologize if I did say that, but okay, we're good. And Brunson is not garbage, Michael Engel.
Any other questions on Stephon?
No, I think that was pretty much it. I see what you're saying about being a high IQ player, great defender, versatile, all great signs. I think that the shooting deficiency is still something to keep in mind. But I think very back in the day when we started talking about the draft, it was a couple weeks ago, I had mentioned if I'm going to draft for one quality in a player this year, it's defense first. And that is what Stephon Castle is. So if we get that 7th pick from Toronto, if he's there, depending on who we draft with our other pick, somebody to keep in mind. I would not be upset if this is the guy that we ended up taking.
Yeah, I wouldn't be upset with him being on the team either. And as much as the shooting thing is still, that's a key for the Spurs. Right. I understand people being frustrated with that. If we were to take him wherever we end up taking him, I think when you combine all the, there's a reason he's rated so highly in so many of these big boards. He was a McDonald's All-American in high school. And one thing I also want to say, I believe in one of the other videos, I may have said that he was a 2-time national champion. That's wrong. Donovan Clingan was a 2-time national champion at UConn, but Stephon Castle, he was a true freshman this year. He just played this season. So 1-time national champion. But all of his inside the arc scoring ability and his defensive ability, Ethan, I think they mitigate I think he's going to be able to score even if it's not from a high volume at the 3-point line. Coming into the league. Now, when I say that, I'm not saying he's going to go for 20 every night just inside the arc. I'm just saying that he's going to be able to go get some buckets, even though he's not going to come in as a 40% 3-point shooter.
I would agree with that 100%. I'm glad that you mentioned that. And just to get this out of the way as we move into the next topic, I did promise Michael Engel, who I do know for people in the comment section, I promised I would say hello to his daughter who's going to bed soon. So hello, Peyton. It's good. It's about time for bed. Your father is tired. There we go.
That is, we got some real content here.
That's going to be a clip. Just that. That's that itself.
This is another person that you could say, like, when you talk about his inside the arc scoring, Victor says Castle's offense reminds me of DeRozan so much right now. And I think there's a lot of shades of DeMar in his offense.
I like that. DeMar's another guy that was like, he's a great scorer now, but in college he was really just an athletic guy. Kind of like what you're describing as Stephon Castle. Yeah, I could see that. Okay, I'm with it. I'm liking this pick more and more now. But before this video started, Jude, I wasn't high on Stephon Castle, but you've really made a convincing argument.
Well, to be honest, after watching him today, I'm a little bit higher on him than I was before too. But really, and this is the last thing I'll say on Stephon before we move on to Rob Dillingham. The thing, once again, that I want to reiterate that stood out to me, like I knew going in, he's going to be able to score inside the arc and he's going to play good defense. Mm-hmm. The playmaking and watching him run sets of one of the more complex offenses in college basketball that is also very successful and has won 2 national championships in a row. That's really like the light bulb. I didn't see that in his game before this.
Easy does not agree. He does not see DeMar DeRozan.
I mean, I'm not saying he's efficient as DeMar DeRozan, but I would say that scoring inside the arc, they have a very similar game whenever it comes to the shots that they're looking for.
I'd say go watch DeMar DeRozan at USC and then come back.
Alrighty, well, let's move on to the second person that we have on the list here, Ethan, and that is Rob with the shifts. Okay, and that's because he's shifty. That's his Instagram username. And after watching, I mean, I watched him throughout the season. He was actually probably one of the guys that I watched the most. And if you've been watching SSPN this year and you watched all our post games and you went through the season with us, he was probably one of the guys that just like whenever we did get, a college question, kind of probably starting around January when we knew where the Spurs were going to be, even if we didn't necessarily have an answer because we haven't dove into the tape like we have now. That was a name that I usually brought up. And a little bit of that does have to do with, it does tie into my boy, Dom Barlow, Ethan. It does tie him to Dom Beasy because last year, before Rob Dillingham was playing for the Kentucky Wildcats, he was playing in overtime elite against Asar and Amen Thompson. As well, he was a teammate with Tyler Smith, who is going to probably be a first-round pick this year out of the G League Ignite, as well as playing against Izan Almansa, who will probably be a second-round pick out of the G League Ignite as well. But I just wanted to mention those 4 players because those are guys who are going to be in the league and just some of the guys that he was playing against in what would have been his senior year in high school. And instead he was at overtime elite, getting paid, all that type of stuff. The whole reason I bring that up is that's how he got on my radar, because for those of you that don't know, after Dominic Barlow was the first player in NBA history signed by Overtime Elite, and I kind of, I don't know if you, whatever you want to call it, the SSPN Dom Barlow lore, I guess is what we'll call it. After that happened, I got in, I just was like, what the heck is this? What is this, semi-pro league or pro league? And kind of ever since then, and with the videos that I made a couple years ago, talking about Dom Barlow's potential when he was still an Austin Spur, I could go on and on about this, but the point is, because of Dom Barlow's connection to Overtime Elite, that kind of opened my eyes to it. It also We picked him up the year prior to Amen and Asar Thompson. So it was like, okay, I need to pay attention to this because these guys are going to be top 10 picks. And last year, we weren't for sure, like you mentioned earlier, that we were going to get that first round pick. So those were potentially guys that, we could maybe add. I remember, we're thinking about maybe Amen Thompson being our point guard. Now he's playing for the Rockets. But with all of that being said, Rob Dillingham, I've got a little bit. I've had some. I don't know. I've had my eye on him for a while because of that. That's what I'm trying to say. And he was somebody that I was high on kind of throughout the season that we would mention from time to time, like I was talking about earlier. But after like really doing and I watched a lot of his highlights through the season, and they stood out to me for a reason. You even remember when we talked about Reed Shepherd pretty recently, not just last week when I kind of reverted on a lot of things I had said, but the week prior, I said that Rob Dillingham stood out a lot more in those games that I had watched that were full through of Kentucky. Now, granted, Rob Dillingham had much better games against LSU, which were mainly the games that I watched, so that had an impact. But the things that I saw in those LSU games, Ethan, they show up on the tape like throughout all the other games too. And I guess I know I've been talking for a while here, so I kind of want to dish it to you at some point, but I know I kind of got to give the breakdown on him. So you just want me to dive into that?
Please drive into it, Jude. Shift into it.
Well, here we go. M. Easy says Dillingham against LSU this year was nuts. I completely agree. It is not corny for him to have that nickname because he's really shifty like that with the ball. The one thing that I wrote down, Ethan, I wrote down one note before I got interrupted and wasn't able to write it down or write down anymore. One of the more explosive scorers off the bounce I've seen since we started doing SSPN. And dude, like when I watched it today, like I got 4 minutes in, Ethan, and it was like all of the LSU memories were coming into my head, but not just the LSU memories, like all the overtime elite highlights I've seen, all just like the little highlights that I've seen, and clips and stuff on Twitter throughout the year, and just the Kentucky games that I've tuned into because I knew they had a bunch of, NBA prospects. Like if you go watch him against Arkansas this year, he completely takes over that game, but I'm not getting into his skills yet. So let me shift a little bit and get into that. I'm a little bit less organized on this one because I didn't have the time to write down all the notes like I did for Stephon. I know a week ago, Ethan, I just came on here. And let me also say, the week prior to a week ago, I made a retraction. And I don't think this is as extreme as a retraction because I'm not saying anything different. Or taking away anything that I said about Nikola Topic. I'm changing my tune, Ethan.
Are you?
Rob Dillingham's my favorite point guard. And I know it's a week later, but I was reminded why he's kind of been my favorite point guard all year. Like in the first 4 minutes of watching the highlights today, Ethan, like I had to pause and I was like, am I really going to have to like change what I say? And I am. That's what I realized. But it was more just I was like, after watching those, like, and this is after watching the Castle highlights, which I just wrote down like all this stuff. Like I watched them back to back today. And after 4 minutes, I was like, this is by far the best prospect I've watched. Yeah. Like, and it's not now. With that being said, I don't think I'm gonna like shift a bunch with him and Topic. Like, I think him and Topic are by far like 1 and 2. You know what I mean? It's not like I'm gonna come on here next week and be like, I have all these other point guards above Topic too. It's just more. I was reminded of why I felt the way that he did kind of throughout the year, or the way that I did throughout the year.
Wow. This is big news. Look, I like Rob Dillingham. I know where you're coming from. He's definitely the guy that jumps off the highlight reel the most, aside from maybe Alexander Sarr, just because of the size and skill set. But It's a toss up, honestly. I could see either between him and Topic. I mean, like who's
That's
got the higher
fair.
upside? Like, because you never know. Like he is so explosive, but he is small. He is 6'3", 175 pounds. I'm not saying small guys can't succeed. I see a comment in the comments right now about if Jalen Brunson can succeed, he can absolutely. I got glimpses of like at his floor. If he is nothing that we think he's going to be, he's still at least Malik Monk level impactful in my eyes. As a small guard that can come in off the bench and be that six man that's highly explosive, right? What scares me is guys like this usually don't have a super high shelf life, but I also got glimpses of possibly Tyrese Maxey watching his highlight reel because of the shiftiness that you had brought up, because of his ability to get downhill and finish amongst the trees through contact. Um,
Yo, I just saw Drew's comment. I'm
uh,
sorry. I got to interrupt you. He says, is 6'3" the new 5'10"? And
ah,
Drew has seen Drew has literally seen Rob Dillingham in person. And what I'll say about this is also in the scouting videos that I did watch, like I think they're like I would not be surprised if he goes to the combine and is
mm,
like 6'1" or 6 foot.
mm,
Like and you see that not just in college basketball, you see that in college football too. A lot of times when they end up going to the combine, it is a little bit inflated height wise, in college athletics.
mm.
Um, but at the same time, um, it's a legitimate question. His size is a legitimate question, but I'm not sure if he's 6'3" is I guess what I was trying to get out there. Back to your
I,
point.
no, I would say that's really his only negative, is his size. And if we can look past that, I think he's pretty polished in all the other areas of the game when you think about it. Like he can shoot. He's shooting what 40+% from three. He can finish with the trees. He's not afraid of contact. From what I saw, it looked like he had a nice handle. I don't know if he's Kyrie level, obviously, but he can dribble. He got the step back to his game. I like whatever comment you just pulled about him playing like an NBA player. Like where you're negative or not negative, but where your point about Castle, about how he kind of plays it in the system and kind of is hindered by college basketball style of play. You can't say that about this guy. Like he kind of took charge of some of these games that he was in and was what an NBA point guard, scoring point guard is supposed to be. Here's the one question I'm going to ask you, Jude. How is he as a natural floor general playmaker? Because when you're playing with Victor Wembanyama and you have Devin Vassell coming off a pin down over here, Keldon Johnson's cutting to the basket, you kind of have to be able to divvy that up and feed those guys. So how is he as a playmaker?
Okay, I'm glad you asked. And there's some other things that I want to get into because there were some other caveats that I was talking about just with watching him in Overtime Elite and all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And also just because I don't have all the notes written down. I didn't, wasn't able to get into all of it. But first off, to answer your question, I would say that he does need some improvement.
Mm-hmm.
Like when it comes to just being a straight up, like, okay, I'm going to call the set, I'm going to set up the set, and then I'm going to, distribute. You know what I mean? I would say that because of his explosiveness, a lot of times his playmaking is kind of freestyled, if you will. But the thing is, he also still led Kentucky in assist rate, and four assists in college
Right, right,
basketball is not that bad. You know what I mean?
right.
Like that's pretty solid. And that was kind of the thing going into it. The two biggest questions, like I talked about Castle, how I knew he was a good inside the arc scorer and defender. I knew that Rob Dillingham was a good shooter, could score off the dribble. The two main questions were his playmaking and his defense. And
Mm.
honestly, after watching more of him, I feel more confident about both of those. And I can get into those reasons, but talking about playmaking, I would just like he definitely is going to need, like if the Spurs draft him, he's going to need to go to Pop how to run an offense school. But because of his off the dribble scoring ability, that entices him to freestyle,
Mm.
from time to time. And a lot of times that does, if he's driving inside and drawing two defenders. I know this is going to sound similar to Castle, but they are kind of similar in the way that they can draw attention with the ball in their hands. that can leave open shooters. We talked about Reed Shepherd last year. Like the majority of Reed Shepherd's threes, if you go look up his shooting highlights, are on assists from Rob Dillingham. But it's not like necessarily in a set. Like maybe it's off a pick and roll, but a lot of times it's like cross court. It's very, a very flashy type of stuff. There was one play where he's like driving inside. I think actually he dishes it. It's like, it's hard to describe, but basically he's driving inside towards the paint. He dishes it to his roll man. I think it was on a pick and roll, but even if it wasn't on a pick and roll, there's someone kind of cutting inside, and that person dishes it right back to him. But when they dish it right back to him, it's almost like, even though it's kind of congested in the lane, there's two guys that immediately go to Rob, because it's like, okay, we're gonna focus on him if he's got the ball in his hand because of his acrobatic ability, at the rim. And he just immediately, he does a no look, it's like he's still dribbling towards those guys, but because his eyes are on them, I just hit my mic, excuse me. But because his eyes are on them, they think he's going towards them. You know what I mean? And he no look, even though it's a guy that's kind of like, maybe like 5 feet to the right of him, he dishes it right back to him, kind of like on a give and go inside the paint. And it's, an easy layup for the big man. There's a lot of different kind of, it's really, you just kind of gotta go watch to like truly understand. But with the handles that he has and the explosiveness off the dribble he has, it's similar to kind of Devin Vassell in that way, that it can kind of create, it's almost like he creates his own offense with the attention that he draws. But I would say it's like he's coming in where Devin is at right now with his off the dribble scoring and just, step back moves, whatever you want to call them. I would say Rob, and we'll have to see how all this translates. But just going off his college tape, it seems like he's kind of where Devin is at right now, like coming into the league. And I know that's saying a lot, but like if you think about Devin Vassell's Florida State tape, he was much more of a 3-and-D guy. I mean, you did see a little bit of some off the dribble creation, but it was still more of that. And then he's kind of developed into that, as he's became a Spur. Rob's going to come in with that ability to just get buckets off the dribble. And the other crazy thing, Ethan, is I watched his Overtime Elite highlights today too, and it translated. Like that's the other, like the stuff that he was doing in Overtime Elite, he's doing in college basketball. And I know the NBA is going to be a completely different level, but I mean, we've seen the success with Amen and Nassar Thompson this year, but more to me, if you watch Overtime Elite, that is like, I mean, that is a freestyle league, which is to his play style. But going from Overtime Elite to, I know that John Calipari just moved to Arkansas, but still, like going to Kentucky under John Calipari, playing in the SEC, there were a lot of question marks going into the season, when it came to that. And one of the other things I saw just doing my research for him is that kind of at the beginning of the season, he was taking, some ill-advised shots early in the shot clock that were more Overtime Elite shots, if you will, that's kind of just going for the highlight play. But he matured throughout the season with his shot making and his decision making on his shot making, also knowing when to pass, when to just space the floor. But the one thing I do want to talk about that is a negative, because I've been talking about a lot of positives, and you mentioned this a little bit earlier, kind of with his finishing ability. He does have a ton of he does have a lot of acrobatic moves, and he can finish over guys who are taller and stronger than him. But sometimes I did see a highlight mix of this, even the negatives too. I didn't just look at all the positives. I did see a good bit of highlights. There are like 2 to 3 minutes of highlights from this season of Rob Dillingham that you could make of him driving kind of mainly in transition, but even sometimes in the half court, and just, it not finishing well in contact. But that ties into his frame, which is what you talked about. Which also ties into his defense. And I'll say my point on this, Ethan, and then I'm going to dish it back to you just so I can get all these Rob Dillingham thoughts out of my brain.
Go ahead.
Defensively, and I think we even read this in the big board from The Ringer when we did that episode. There are times that he gets drove past because he reaches too much, trying to get a steal. or just overexerts himself or overextends himself defensively, but it's not because of a lack of effort. And with that being said, you can find some plays where maybe his effort does tail off a little bit. Like you could say that his effort's not consistent defensively always, but it's more, I would say, whenever he doesn't give that effort, it's more because like he missed a scheme and he's just like, oh my gosh, I totally just like whiffed there, which is, a testament to how he can get better defensively. But there's also times where he's reading passing lanes that are giving, wide open transition layups or dunk attempts. As much as I talked about him having, some trouble sometimes in that area finishing through contact, there are multiple times where he got a steal and had wide open lanes, and those are huge impact plays. There were times also where, I can show you, well, I just told you I can show you the highlights of him missing those shots, and I can show you some highlights defensively too, where he kind of maybe gives up on a possession after he realizes he made a mistake and is just kind of already beat. You can also find possessions where he's one-on-one on ball on a dude and is, just hounding him the whole time and forcing a turnover or forcing, a brick. And the main thing that stood out to me, and obviously all the highlights are going to be positive, but when he is giving high effort, Ethan, and the other thing is you got to understand he's giving a ton of effort on offense too. It's not just when he has the ball in his hand. They used him in a lot of off-ball situations, and he's sprinting off screens, man. Like, it's hustle whether he's got the ball in his hand or he doesn't. And so when that happens, like sometimes you're going to take defensive possessions off. Like, and I know this is going to sound so stupid because we're talking about a guy who hasn't come in the NBA yet. But like LeBron takes defensive possessions off sometimes. You know what I'm saying? Like, right. And I know that's a completely different thing. But when you are carrying the scoring load for your team, like Rob Dillingham was in a lot of situations for Kentucky this year, sometimes that can impact him too. And that's something he has to get better at. But when he is full focus, has all the energy, he is a high energy, active effort defender. And like, yes, there may be some times that he gets beat because of that, but there's nobody else other than the Spurs development staff and Greg Popovich that I think could hone that effort and the intensity and the ball pressure that he tries to put on guys. Like when they see those things, like on the scouting report, and who knows who the Spurs pick, but regardless, when they're scouting Rob Dillingham and they see those things on the tape, they're going to be like, okay, these are some things that we can work with. Like, yes, it's not completely clean. It's not completely polished, but it's better than I thought because of the effort that I saw from him from what I watched.
Right. Defensively, small guards have always kind of had, or historically defensively, small guards have always gone for steals. And when you go for steals, sometimes you get beat. It sounds like he kind of suffers from the same syndrome, but as long as his effort is there, Pop and the coaching staff will have no problem, like you said, teaching him to have a little bit higher of an IQ and maybe not taking chances where they're not necessary. You know what I mean? But also still allow him to have those instincts, because if he does have those instincts and he is as cat quick as you and the highlight reel are saying that he is, it's a recipe for high steal volume, which is something that we don't necessarily get from Trey Jones, but we do get high IQ defense from Trey Jones. But physically, he's going to get beat a lot more often than, say, Rob will, only because Rob has the speed and athleticism to maybe poke the ball loose or at least stick with the guy better than Trey Jones has had the ability to. So in that regard, he is an improvement. Also, as a shooter, he's a way better improvement. And I think playing in the pick and roll, he could maybe be slightly improved, only in the sense of just like when you come off a pick and roll, you know what Trey Jones is going to do. When Rob Dillingham comes off a pick and roll, you don't know what he's going to do. He can step back. He can pull up from the elbow. He can drive and finish.
It's completely different tiers. Like, and I know that Rob Dillingham has not played an NBA game yet, but when I think about Rob Dillingham in comparison, and God bless Trey Jones, because I think he is a fantastic player, and he's gonna have an NBA career for a long time because of the skills that he brings. But it's just, like y'all see it in my eyes, and you can probably hear it in my voice, even if you're just listening on podcast. Since we've started talking about him, he just stood
Mm.
out to me, dude. And the other thing that I want to say is, like maybe another question could be his off ball. Like, okay, well, how is he going to fit next to Devin? If he's an on-ball player, we already have Devin. Like, Devin's the two-man game guy with Wemby. Why do we need another on-ball player that's just going to be another mouth to feed? We just saw what happened with the Suns. That doesn't always work out. I get the train of thought. I really do. But like I mentioned earlier, he played next to Reed Shepherd. Not only did he play next to Reed Shepherd, Ethan, we talked about this in the Reed Shepherd clip and segment that we did last week. He came in and I said, I wasn't sure if it was 3 or 4 to 5 star guards that he came in with. Watching his highlights, I confirmed it. It was 4. It was Reed Shepherd, Rob Dillingham, who both came off the bench. Drew talked about that earlier. I put that clip up when you were talking earlier, Ethan. DJ Wagner, who was a projected lottery pick coming into the season. And then I don't know his first name, but I know I saw him in a picture with the other 3 guys talking about. That's how I got this idea that there were 3 to 4, 4 to 5 star guards. Reeves, number 12. I forget his first name, but he was another like top level point guard that they brought in. So you're bringing in an entire backcourt, starters and and backups that he's having to come in and compete against. That he had to Antonio Reeves. Thank you, Drew King. He corrects me there. And yeah, Ethan, I'm kind of losing my train of thought. I know I was talking about those two and Kentucky and all that type of stuff. And how he kind of had to work around, playing with those guys. That's and I'm remembering where I'm at, Ethan. He had to play with a lot of those are 3 other ball dominant top level high school recruits, that he had to learn how to play next to. And because of his off ball shooting ability and the way that he hustles in his off ball movement, like I alluded to earlier, I think that anyone who has concerns for ball dominance and ball hogging, with him and Devin, if you will, I'm not saying either are ball hogs, but you get what I'm saying. I think that they would be able to play off of each other very well. And actually, I think those two being next to each other would create tons of more looks for Devin and Rob. But also, I'm talking about them two without even factoring in Victor. Do you think the two, I think the two-man game with Devin and Victor is very fun to watch. That's one of the positives that we've talked about all season. But as I mentioned earlier, Ethan, I think Rob is coming. Even if he's not at the same level as Devin is right now, like the comparison I made earlier, even though I do think that is like a realistic comparison, he is still coming in with much more off the dribble ability than Devin did coming in. You know what I'm saying? And so, him in the two-man game with Wemby, Ethan, would be, I start getting giddy thinking about it. Like it would just be when you have a shot maker like him with the creation ability, on-ball creation ability that he has, and you pair him next to Victor, and then you have Devin off the ball as a shooter, or vice versa. You have the two-man game that's going to improve with Wemby and Devin this summer, with what Devin alluded to, them working in the gym throughout this offseason. Then you have a sniper like Rob Dillingham playing off of that. Also, I think you see the train of thought that I'm getting here, Ethan. And I have an article about this that I'm going to pull up here in a second, but give me your thoughts on all of that.
I only want to say one last thing about Rob Dillingham. For me, I think you've covered him perfectly well. My favorite thing about him is if it's true. Let me preface that. He and his camp have reportedly been sending out.
You stole my thing, Ethan.
Go ahead. Did I really?
No, go ahead.
Have reportedly been saying that San Antonio is where he wants to be. So for a player at his caliber to allegedly say that means a lot for us as Spurs fans, because that's not something that we typically hear. We heard it from Victor, and now we're hearing it from Rob Dillingham.
Yeah, so that was the article that I was about to bring up. And I can't remember, I'm forgetting his name right now, but there was another NBA reporter who works for Fansided who quote tweeted this article and said that he's been hearing that Rob Dillingham's camp, like you just said, has been telling people that they would prefer to play with the Spurs. But there's the why pick him reasons to hesitate. That's not really what I'm focused on here. More what I'm focused on is the overall thoughts. Dillingham's camp is telling anyone who will listen that his preferred landing spot is in San Antonio. Multiple scouts have told me it'd be surprising if the Spurs pass on Dillingham due to his seamless fit next to Victor Wembanyama. If Dillingham is on the board, I'm convinced the Spurs pick him even with the first pick, a scout for a Western Conference team told me. And this is LJ Ellis as of spurstalk.com. And this website's been around for a while. And regardless of even if that ends up to be true, the fact that there's a scout out there saying that is still significant for the time of year we're at right now, Ethan.
Extremely exciting times, Jude. Extremely exciting times.
Yeah. I don't mean to flip-flop like that, but it's just like I just realized it. And the other thing too, just going back to the Topic conversation, and I still by far have him at 2. Like I think there's a gap between the point guards after Topic and Rob. But and this is a whole nother thing. I saw people talking about this last time, and I think this is a little overblown. But if I'm just being completely honest and just, being real here, like the SEC is more of a proving ground for the NBA than the Serbian League. With that being said, I think the European leagues are gaining a lot of ground, and that's why you're seeing guys like Wemby, Jokic, Giannis, all this surge of European talent, even Alexandre Sarr coming in this year. There's a couple different French prospects, Zachary Rissache. There's another one that I don't even know how to pronounce his name that we haven't talked about that could go in the lottery. But you're seeing a lot more of these European prospects. So I do think that the game overseas, like I think probably people saying like, oh, Topic isn't going to work out just because he plays in the Serbian league is a little harsh. But I will say objectively, the level of competition that Rob went up against is more of, like I said, it's more of a proving ground than the Serbian league when it comes to translating to the NBA.
Right. And just to address a few comments that we had in the last
missed
about Topic saying that he wasn't athletic enough, he's not strong enough, not fast enough. I just want to remind everyone, have we not learned? Have we not learned, Jude? Like the last handful of guys that we've said that about have been really, really good and translated. So I just, as much I love Rob Dillingham's tape, I think I'm on board with you, Jude, and like if it's between him and Topic at whatever pick, I might lean Rob Dillingham. But even with that being said, that I still have like a knot in my stomach, just like the fear of what Topic could be because of the fact that European players, especially with his skill set, are coming over and just quickly ingraining themselves in the NBA. So that fear is definitely still there.
And he is a little bit younger than Rob Dillingham as well.
Right, exactly.
There's pros and cons to both, but the one thing that I want to say, this is the last thing I'll say on Rob Dillingham, Ethan. If you go watch the highlights and, I mentioned Overtime Elite and you look at his play style, it is favorable to like highlight culture, if you will. But if you go watch the full game tape, like it's not just highlights, is I guess what I'm trying to say. Like you see this throughout the game. You can see him take over the Arkansas game and score 30 plus. Like Easy mentioned earlier, the games he had against LSU, both of those this year, almost single-handedly bringing them back. And as much as I even mentioned like him having some struggles finishing through contact, there are 2 specific plays that stand out in my mind from the LSU game where he's like kind of almost sandwiched between 2 defenders at the rim, and he's going up and under and finding a way to put it off the glass. So like even in the areas where there's deficiencies, he has shown positive flashes. Like it's not like he doesn't have the ability to do those things. It's just like his size at the end of the day, like you said, I mean, with every small point guard, there's going to just be deficiencies with size, but that doesn't mean they can't become all-stars at the same time, But really, other than that, like, okay, you could maybe say there's a little bit of defensive fundamental stuff, but with the effort that I saw from him, it's like, okay, well, one, he's obviously trying. Like
Mhm.
I'd rather you have a fundamental defensive issue than an effort issue on defense. And 2 or 3, if he's getting drafted by us, I just have a lot of faith that we can make his defense better.
Couldn't agree more, Jude.
But yeah, that's pretty much my Bible on Rob Dillingham there.
We'll be right back after this short message.
Oh my gosh. Well, there was another article that I was going to get to here, Ethan, but I think we can pretty much wrap the show up. And honestly, I can save it for next time.
Right.
But there is, just to give you all a little bit of a preview, since we'll save it, there was an article that was released from Jeff G. Spurs Zone today, catching up with Blake Wesley, previewing his offseason. But since we're already an hour and a half into this thing, we can save that for the next one so we can have some content.
I like that idea. Plus, Ethan has to use the restroom.
There we go. Guys, I know there were a lot of comments in here, and I see there's still 50 of you guys in here. We appreciate the support on all the content lately, whether it's the clips. The early Spurs draft preview is still going up. We appreciate you guys. Also, the streams. The last 2 we've had have both got over 1,000 views, so we really appreciate the offseason support. And I wish I could have got to some more comments in this episode, but we wanted to stay on topic, get through all our stuff, and now it's already been an hour and a half, and me and Ethan do have some other things to do, and I think all of us want to go ahead and get to the playoffs a little bit as well.
Right on, Jude. The Heat Nation is dying inside.
When I say that, I would like to say I was referring to the 2-2 series that starts in 30 minutes.
Mavericks Clippers. That's the one we want to watch.
And it'll be interesting to see if Kawhi plays, and I don't think he's going to, but I think that's probably a good thing for the Clippers with how the games have went so far.
Right on. Come on, Luka. Lock up, baby.
But I am excited to watch that game. We appreciate you guys tuning in today. Don't forget to hit the like and the subscribe button below if you want to support the channel. You can also follow us on Twitter or X, whatever you want to call it, at SSPN on YT, at Jude McLaren, and at Ethan_Quintero to stay updated with everything. And also, our boy Greg earlier, he jumped up in here and he said, nice hats, guys. And if you guys like the hats or any of the logos that we have here, I will say I'm not sure how much longer this logo is going to be here, Ethan. The hemisphere one. I'm not saying anything's imminent, but if you want to get this design that matches this year's City Edition, you probably want to do that like at least before the draft this year or something like that. I already saw the Spurs changed their YouTube logo, and I talked about the alien inspiration I got. So there may be some more stuff coming out. But regardless, if you want to support the show, you can check out our merch as well on sspn.myspreadshop.com. We appreciate you guys. We'll catch y'all in the next one, and go Spurs go.